Good morning. My name is Chris. You should know me now that I'm the founder of 400K First. And I wanted to do something to kind of provide some background in terms of anthropology and psychology about some of the progression of man. Before I do that, I want to mention this is a lovely location here up in the Carolinas by a really beautiful river. We've got a rather cool morning this morning. It's like 50 degrees. Last day of spring, tomorrow is summer. June 21st, but I just wanted to kind of pick a natural setting here and then just kind of deliver this. When I was in graduate school in Southern California, working on my master's in clinical social work, one of our professors brought in a book from an anthropologist. His name was Ernest Becker, and he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. The book he brought in was called The Birth and Death of Meaning. Becker is best known for his book called The Denial of Death, which he won the Pulitzer Prize for. He was a guy who was in the infantry in Vietnam, came back, and then went on to get his doctorate in anthropology at Syracuse University. Ended up coming to Berkeley, and he was a pretty contentious guy. He bucked the system quite a bit, so much so that he was asked to leave Syracuse, and then he came back. Same thing happened to Berkeley, but he also attracted students for this. A lot of his contentiousness had to do. He was speaking out with people's ability for First Amendment rights, the right to speech. And of course, this is coming back from the Vietnam War. I myself am an Army veteran. He wanted those students to have the right for free speech that was going on in the movement then. But more to the point, what the anthropologist that he was talking about is that from basically the dawn of man is that tribes evolved. And then they evolved because they would have the hunters, the men, and they had the gatherers, the women. And a lot of it centered around hunting for food. This is what their basic needs were at that time. And as skills, as they acquired more skills, the hunters got better in getting food and so forth. And I'm just going to read a little bit about the book to put this in perspective here. I'm just going to say that what they believe that just popular writers of the day try to convince us that what we call distinctively human is something we really share with baboons, rugged individualism, indiscriminate sex, selfish grabbing of food and females, fighting for domination of the weak. But to make such analogies is not only cheap journalism, it is all wrong. Anthropologists know better. Man developed away from apes precisely because they had to hunt meat. And if you want to hunt meat, you cannot afford yourself the luxury of baboon behavior. For one thing, if males want to get larger game, they need to cooperate in the hunt. The larger and more dangerous the game, the more sensitive and the intimate the cooperation. This means you cannot fight over the kill or over the females back at camp when you bring back the kill. The band has to function, or the tribe, as an organized unit that prepares in repose and that plans together in action, and so that you need to have rules about social relations. The best way to get cooperation among volatile, erotic primates is to regulate sexual regulations. So anthropologists have studied this over time, and they realized that whoever the chieftain was within the tribe, that the way to regulate relations was to regulate social behavior and to regulate the sexual relations. Who can mate with whom can live with whom regularly, and so on. By setting up such customs and marriage taboos, you establish families and provide sexual partners between the families. In a word, the invention of sexual codes establishes harmony and cooperation in mating units and in bands composed of such units. The result of this, one of his colleagues, his peers, is Marshall Sahlins, also an anthropologist, is so well pointed, is that you get your recognition from others not on what you take like baboons, but on what you give. And Becker's thesis was that basically man is driven by his own self-esteem, rewarding self-esteem. So whether it's a baseball game for a little league and kids playing for a trophy, they're rewarded by self-esteem. Back 70,000 years ago, they were rewarded by the community and the tribe because of the meat that they would have got. So as they began to cooperate together, as they regulated sexual relations in the group, they got more social cohesion in the group. And I'm just providing some background here. Today's anthropologists, now that this is 2022, have basically taken the narrative that there's a social construct in anthropology, and a lot of it has to do with culture, with gender identity. And so the narrative being made up now by a lot of cultural anthropologists is that it passes in time. It's created. People develop with feelings and things like that. So these books were written back in the 1960s. I was in graduate school in the late 80s. They were still relevant books then. I'm going to realize that some of the text is not relevant. But what still is relevant is civilization and man and how we got as far as we've come. So basically, it's only the last 50 years, the 1960s to the present, that you may discuss the fact that maybe gender identification, gender expression has come into the language. But I'm going to bring up, we have a couple of different situations just in the last 2 years. Number one is the riots that we had just 2 years ago in 2020. Not so much to hang on the BLM, it's a very important, significant symbol of that. But really, if we look at all the cities and how fast they fell apart, it's really more a social function of what was going on in those cities. So we had the LGBT interwebbed into the cities. We had, as we have in all cities, we have a large diversity of people. But when we had something like that happen, and of course the police stepped back, and we gave the people, we reduced the amount of police, we gave them what they want, they still continued to fall apart. And then it was in really accelerated fashions. So we would see 90 to 120 day periods. So we've seen this in Seattle, we saw it in Minneapolis, we saw it in Chicago, New York. I don't explain it, but it's exceptionally rapid. So when we talk about social tribes in anthropology, there has to be some type of social cohesion that happens between the tribes for these things to happen. The other big thing that's happened just 90 days ago is after the parental rights bill in education that Governor DeSantis passed, is that just within 10 days of that, Disney came out against it because they were pushed. And then literally just 2.5 weeks ago, June 4th, Bob Chapka, the CEO, came back and he fired the executive, I believe his last name is Rice, I think it's Dan Rice, because he was basically, he wanted to welcome those values in. And Chapka came in, they've lost about 35% stock value. Again, that's not even 90 days. So from the time that they came out, DeSantis came out on March 8th, Disney came out on the 22nd of March. It was only basically the end of May, and then actually the beginning of June that they came out and CEO fired Bob Rice. So what I'm trying to display is here that we see these new tribes, if you will, and trends in cities and so forth. They don't have a lot of stick-to-itiveness. So the DNA that we look at normal communities when they fashion themselves, men, women, families, schools, churches, other educational things, and government institutions, as we take a look at the LGBT and where they've come since the 1960s, we actually begin to take a look at what's the thickness on, what's the depth of what they have, and it doesn't appear that it's really that much, because otherwise, why would so many of these cities have failed so fast? So my contention is, and this is just my view, is that the LGBT, as they string themselves in, they're so involved on the superficial aspect of their identity that there's not a lot of depth and roots that they're making as their peers, heterosexuals, men, women, are raising children, going to school, getting jobs. It's the focus on their identities really undermines what they're trying to do. So the other groups that get together, and unfortunately, the Black Americans with the BLM, and of course we have other things going on in the city. These things just rapidly fell apart, and we find ourselves now, and you see finally, we see more groups like myself coming out and talking. A year ago, when I formed 400K First, I couldn't put this on the internet. I would have been canceled. So if we look at this tribal things, the LGBT came in and they actually shut down freedom of speech, the ability to speak out, and it's only because of what Governor DeSantis has done that I'm able to do. So we lost the ability for freedom of speech. We're looking at giving up sexual rights in a group that's basically what I consider is recreational personalities. And I say that because it's basically from the time that our parents, my parents, came back from World War II, we had the 50s and 60s, that we had a lot more recreational time. Then into the 70s and the 80s, we had much more recreational time, and then people were able to experience with more things they want to do, which included genders. So I'm going to get right into this. I want to kind of wrap this up a little bit. What I've done is I want to believe that there's a way that we can work together on things. And before we just break down and get into arguments with one another, one of the things I thought we'd focus on is what are some of the top 10 actually health issues that we have in society right now. Of the top 10 right now, heart disease is still number one, followed by stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary. This is obviously came up during COVID. Lung, which also. 6, diabetes. 7, dementia, Alzheimer's. 8, intestinal viruses and bacteria. This shows up more in poor countries. Tuberculosis, lung issues. This also shows up in poor countries. And cirrhosis, damage to the liver. I also wanted to get into some of the physical disabilities that we as a society have to deal with, or we want to look at. Acquired brain injury, spinal cord, many of this is caused by accident, cerebral palsy, spina bifida, which is incomplete formation of the spine, cystic fibrosis, epilepsy, MS, muscular sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, Tourette's syndrome, and dwarfism. So these are ongoing issues that we have. I wanted to go back, it seems like these are almost biblical ones: blindness, deaf, mute, cleft palate. So we have a lot of what I consider other health issues to work on. I also had to add obesity. I know that in COVID, we know that one of the comorbidities is obesity, but it's one of the top 5, I think, things that we have to work on within our society right now. And then we get into issues like psychological issues: depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar. We have a lot more. And my point in doing this is that as we come together as a society and try to realize what are we focusing on here when we're talking to LGBT, because 96% of the population is basically, they're trying to raise their families, they're trying to go to work, they're trying to survive. Of course, we've got all the gas issues, but they do these things that generally people do to progress things along. And then along comes the LGBT. And they've got what I consider, again, these recreational personalities. And, we can look at this and, if you'll just apologize, I call it long-term pretending and acting in role. We have some of, I think, what would be some of the more current things that we might focus on right now might be racism. I think that the Hispanics, I apologize for my writing. What people aren't realize, Hispanics are very soon going to become the majority population in America, and probably only the next 2 presidential cycles, or maybe end up being white America. They're going to be Hispanic largely after that. My belief is that we should be locking arms with the Black Americans, Hispanics, and whites, and walking together so we can begin to face some of these other more focal issues, education and things like that, than getting caught up in what I consider somewhat insignificant gender issues. And my takeaway from this is, having looked at this, having worked in social services a long time, having worked in juvenile services for a long time, is it's really just a selfish expression of man. And again, I may get some kickback from that, but I don't really care, because most of us are working to get ahead. Most of us have integrity with what we do, and that's why I'm doing this. And the reason that I have, and I know that maybe this black flag is a little disconcerting to some, but it's the 400,000 kids that are born every day. And my belief is that what is our stewardship and leadership for these kids? Because these kids are eventually going to make it to the classrooms. And those classrooms, we now know, there's people in there that may try to groom them and take them away from their sex. And that's not a tribal thing that we really want going on, which is why Governor DeSantis has stepped in. Fundamental to that is, since I started charting this just back in March, we have now about 23 states that have either passed parental rights laws, or they passed athletic rules within the colleges and the high schools that are going to bar transgender athletes from competing in the women's sports and taking away their rights and privileges. And so the last thing I'm going to do is the media is really driving this, and most of you may know that they're trying to trigger you into being afraid to speak out against. But there's people like me who aren't afraid to speak out against it. And I want to let you know that if we focus not only on the kids that we need to raise, getting them into schools, raising them to be young men, women, and leaders, and we can all focus on the health issues we have, the top diseases, physical, mental. But I think it's time to take our eye off these, really what I call the recreational personalities and selfish identities, because what the selfish identities have now begun to take over the narrative in our society. And then people are going to argue it's not real, but it's so far away from what heterosexual society is doing that it's just distracting. And it distracts us, my last time I'll do it distracts us from our ability to focus on some of these more important things. And I think that's my point in this, is that I want people to leave from what I've had today, is that do not be afraid of that. You can speak up and talk about it. You're going to see that I'm coming out with t-shirts. The 400K thing, even if only a decal, most of you believe this and get it. We really want to protect the stewardship and leadership of all the kids born into the world here, and especially in America. So I hope you're with me on this. hope to do some more videos. I thank you for your time. A year from now, this is going to be huge. All the corporations that came out and then have gone woke against, if you will, heterosexuals, I guarantee you a year from now, they're going to be a part of this movement because this is going to be huge. So if anyone out there knows any NASCAR branding people, Chick-fil-A, Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's, have them call me if they want to get behind this, because we have the data, we have time over 70,000 years, we care about the leadership and effectiveness of raising kids, and I think you want to get behind this. And again, I thank you for your time.